Hello and welcome to part two of working with trauma. So ideally, you need to have watched part one because that just gives you an overview of what the impact of trauma is on the brain and on the body, and also an understanding of what trauma is. And so then when we're thinking about the brain and the body, that's really important in terms of then knowing when people are responding from a trauma place, and what the potential impact is, in terms of then how they're functioning. So yes, it is really important if you can just to make some time to download part one to watch that, because then much of what we're saying in part two will make sense. That's great. So my name is Dr Claire Stubbs and I'm a counselling psychologist, and I work with Boingboing, and Boingboing is a community interest company, and we're particularly interested in looking at the research and practice around resilience, and then transferring that research, into practice. So, and we're particularly interested in the most disadvantaged individuals and communities. So those people or communities where they're more likely to kind of potentially have experienced trauma, or disadvantage or poverty, and then don't potentially have access to resources or services or support in support of getting through those challenges and difficulties. So then thinking from a resilience-based approach, how we can embed our work so that then to ensure that everybody has access to the support that they need. So following on from last week, or part one, so and just thinking about what's important. So we talked about how trauma responses are automatic and instinctual, so the child will be unaware if they're triggered into a fight or flight response, because it happens in 7 milliseconds basically, where the amygdala in the brain sends a message to the autonomic nervous system that the child is in danger. So then what we talked about in part one as well is how we need to then be children's frontal lobes. So the frontal lobe is at the, as it says, at the front of the brain, and this is our logical, rational part of our brain. And in what we were saying in part one is that when children have been traumatized, that aspect of their brain, it doesn't develop anyway fully until about 12 years old. Whereas actually, if a child has been traumatized, then this aspect can also be further compromised. So then children who have been traumatized don't necessarily have that bridge between the logical and emotional brain in the way that those of us that haven't been traumatized take for granted. So then what that means is as well that they haven't been able to form a narrative or a story, or be able to interpret things that happen emotionally. So they're not able to say, oh, actually, I got frightened, but there wasn't anything to be frightened about, or when that person jumped out on me, it reminded me of this scenario that happened, a few weeks ago that was really frightening at home. They just won't have that capacity, partly because they're children, and also, like I say, because that logical, rational aspect of their brain, could be compromised in terms of the trauma that they've experienced. So then furthermore on that point, so children will be unable to focus or comprehend logical information when their autonomic nervous system is in red or amber. So we can't think basically because the frontal lobe shuts down. So then the focus needs to be on calming the body and helping them in terms of grounding. So we're going to look at some grounding techniques today. children who are traumatized see the world through that lens, so see things how they were rather than how things are. We all have an innate capacity to kind of look out, if you like, for threat, and this is called our neuroception. And again, so often when people are traumatized, this can, like I say, kind of it's that part of their system has been overworked because it's been constantly looking out for threat, and then, like I say, kind of ends up seeing the world as it has been rather than as it is. Yet there's hope in the work that we do because we can enhance their procedural memory, so we can help them build capacity in their procedural memory whereby they can actually remember you advising them, this is what happens in your body when you're feeling this way, so then it is possible to respond in a different way, even though they won't be able to think in the moment. The procedural memory is an aspect of our long-term memory, so we can build capacity there and help children, like I say, kind of build up the knowledge that is there so that then they can remember later down the line how to respond in a different way. That is, so the focus is on building their skills and building their capacity. Children with trauma histories may struggle with their cognitive ability. And this, there's more research in neuroscience that is kind of helping us understand the impact on the brain all the time. I'm not a neuroscientist, but like I say, so those, like I've just been saying, those areas of the brain that are responsible for memory and logical processing or reasoning, can be compromised. So then obviously this can impact on children's ability to function and process cognitive tasks. And then furthermore, also alongside this, so sensory overload may also be a challenge for children who have trauma histories. So we're going to be thinking about working with trauma, adopting a resilience-based approach. And, why is this? And the reason being is because a traditional psychological approach doesn't necessarily take account of the social inequalities that exist, and how they perpetuate the difficulties that the child might be experiencing. For example, if a family are living in poverty, let's say hypothetically, isn't it, if there hasn't been passed down through the generations, there may be a difficulty in terms of communicating. And so then if there's lots of conflict or domestic violence in that house, then that's also then going to impact on the child's experience. So it's not to say that all houses that experience poverty struggle with communication. This could be an issue. Or actually, in terms of if someone's living in poverty, then obviously it's going to be harder for them to access the support that they need to overcome the challenges that they're facing. So then obviously it can compound those difficulties that exist because they become more entrenched, and then it's more of a challenge. Obviously, the later on children are in their lives, if these difficulties become more entrenched, then it's more likely, or there's a greater risk in terms of it becoming a mental health difficulty. So a resilience-based approach, obviously we take a lot of our learning from psychology in terms of thinking about how we can intervene. A resilience-based approach is much more inclusive of context, when taking action and kind of thinking about how we need to intervene. So really considering the social context and the area in which the children are living in, or the time in which they're living in as well, and how that might be impacting. COVID is a really good example. For example, just thinking about now, for those families that are already living in poverty or in disadvantage, and then how, COVID, for example, might potentially have impacted on their experiences, particularly, like I say, if there's domestic violence in the home, or somebody becomes unemployed, the stress and strain that can add to the situation. So a resilience-based approach, will be kind of considering these things, whereas a psychological approach on its own won't necessarily take into account those things, and then also how it's impacting. A resilience-based approach also takes account of a range of needs for the individual, whereas sometimes psychology can limit its focus to those early experiences. So you'll see when we look at the framework that a resilience-based approach is much more holistic, so thinking about all aspects of the child or the young person's life when considering resilient moves, and taking from academics like Bronfenbrenner, for example, and really considering the whole system, and how the whole system will have an impact on the child's life. And then also there's an opportunity there in terms of thinking about how we might intervene. So then if we take our learning from psychology to inform some of the responses that we might make in terms of working with trauma, then we integrate a resilience approach too. So then we're thinking about more of a community psychology approach. So that actually, like I say, kind of thinks about the not just the individual, but also the individual within their family system, then thinking about the community they're living in, and then thinking about what's happening politically, for example, in the wider social context, and then how that also impacts on that child's experience and their ability to kind of, for their resilience to be supported. So this is the resilience framework, and for those of you who haven't seen this before, so Angie Hart and Derek Linko and Helen Thomas met with a community of practice of parents, carers, children and young people in an attempt to transfer the evidence base from the resilience research into something that could then be used in practice, because the frustration for Angie Hart, for example, was that there wasn't something that practitioners, and we say practitioners in the general sense of parents, carers, young people, we're all practitioners in terms of resilience. So there wasn't something that people could then transfer into their everyday practice in terms of the research. So the framework gives us that. So it's split into 5 component parts, and it's very much about, considering what are the risks in a child or young person's lives, and then what can we put in place in terms of these protective factors that will support the reduction in terms of promoting their resilience, and therefore reducing the odds that they're facing in terms of their resilience. So, and like I say, so all of these resilient moves have been taken from the resilience research, and then once we put them into practice, we increase the likelihood in terms of someone's resilience. And there's 42 potential resilient moves that we can make here. So, and then down the bottom, you'll see that you've got the noble truths, and these are the core values and the philosophy, if you like, that runs through the framework. And I'll talk about them once I've introduced you to the framework. So first you've got basics, and again this is where the social inequalities comes in. So because not everybody has access to good enough housing or enough money to live. So, and a traditional psychological approach wouldn't necessarily take those things into consideration when intervening. So this framework is, like I say, kind of very much sees that actually, of course, isn't it, if somebody hasn't got good enough housing or enough money to live, then of course that's going to impinge on their capacity around their resilience, and also kind of then impact on, you know, what they have access to or their mental health. So then you have belonging, and belonging has taken the research around attachment theory, yet also has added to that in terms of thinking about those attachments later in life as well, because we know from the evidence base. So Sroof et al., for example, have done a lot of research in terms of adolescence and saying actually there is a second opportunity to intervene, and that those attachments later in life can also make a really big difference. Then you have learning, and it's called learning purposefully rather than education, because again, if we have people living in disadvantage or experiencing poverty, they might not always have access to mainstream education. So for that reason, we've called this compartment learning. And this is about how we can make school or college life work as well as possible, highlighting the child's achievements and helping them develop those life skills necessary in terms of supporting their resilience, like problem solving, for example, and helping the child or young person organise themselves. So, and obviously we're going to be thinking about the framework entirely in the context of learning when thinking about the work that you're doing. Then you've got coping, and this is the skills around supporting children around their emotions. So helping them see, for example, you know, remembering tomorrow is another day, understanding boundaries and keeping within them. So, and then at the bottom there, and one of the most recent additions is around having a laugh. And then lastly, we have core self, and this is the most individual, I guess, aspect of the framework. So helping the child foster their talents. And again, if we think about that with the social inequalities lens, it's all, you know, it's easy enough, isn't it, to suggest that Johnny goes to a hobby or takes up kickboxing, whereas actually, again, you know, for a family living in disadvantage, you know, do they have money to get Johnny to kickboxing? You know, do they have capacity to get them there if mum is working 3 jobs just to make ends meet? So all of these things really need to be considered, and we really focus on that nitty-gritty attention to detail when we're thinking through a resilience lens, rather than, like I say, a traditional psychology approach that might not necessarily take those things into consideration. And we'll be thinking much more about that as we go along. So then, as promised, we've got the noble truths down the bottom here, and the first one is about accepting. And you know, you'll know better than anyone, you know, sometimes it can be really hard to accept the choices and decisions that people are making in their lives. And actually, you know, everyone has a story and there's a history around that. You know, so it's really about trying to, you know, dig deep within ourselves and accept where that person is starting from. Like I say, we've all been on our own journeys and arrived at where we've arrived at, and not everyone has access to the same path, I guess. So it's really trying to accept where that family or where that child or young person is at. And then, when we can do that, it massively impacts on how we approach the work. Because we, obviously then we're much more validating, and also then thinking about, and also what help do they need, in terms of, like we say, kind of increasing the odds, or reducing the odds. Sorry, I don't know why I keep saying that today. Reducing the odds that they face in terms of their resilience. And sometimes it's hard and we struggle to accept. And then I think it's just really important, from a practitioner point of view, that you have networks or support mechanisms in place where you can bring those struggles and share your struggles around accepting what's happening with colleagues that you work with in terms of debriefing, so that then it doesn't come into the work. It's really important that you have a space to share those frustrations or those challenges that you're facing. Then next we've got conserving, and this is about a bit like the jam in the jar. So preserving, what's worked well. Has there been anything for this family or this child or this young person that's worked particularly well around this particular issue that you're struggling with in the past? Or is there anything in their sphere or their network or the system which you find them in that's working particularly well? And then how can we conserve that and make the best of that, or make more of that? Then you have commitment, and commitment is, as it says on the tin, often, particularly in this, particularly in the system that we're working in at the moment, commitment can be challenging because of funding and funding cuts, for example. So I often say, it's really important that we say to people from the beginning that our work may end at some point, just so that people are aware, but actually that we will, kind of work through that and let them know. Because again, isn't it, we may be working with people that have had difficult endings or abrupt endings, or people haven't let them know when they're leaving, if we're thinking about trauma. So it's really important that we make a commitment, I guess, to honouring the ending. And actually, though, as much wherever possible, isn't it, that we go into this work with a long-term view, knowing that we can see it through, because that's so important for people. And then lastly, we've got enlisting, and this is about, strategically thinking through who do we need to enlist in support of the work. Who in the child system, is there an opportunity to build on a particular role that somebody has, or is there another service where you might be able to tap into to do a different piece of work? But just really carefully thinking through, is that for the benefit of this person? Because obviously we know people in the system as well can often get passed around from pillar to post, and that's not helpful either. So it's just about, like I say, really carefully thinking through, are we enlisting, who are we kind of thinking of when we're signposting people on, and what's the real benefit and what's the real gain there for that family or that child or that young person. And then often I think when we're thinking about the framework, so also then, and maybe just take a moment, to pause the recording and just think about these different areas of the framework. So basics, belonging, learning, coping, and core self. And thinking about which different aspects of you might you need to enlist in order to stretch yourself and do things differently. So for me, as a psychologist, for example, my go-tos tend to be belonging, coping, and the core self work. So I do have to enlist different aspects of me, to kind of really think through around learning, and also to be considering the basics. So, because I guess I was trained in a traditional psychological way of working, and then now I've integrated a more resilience-based approach. So just pause the video for a few minutes and think about, like I say, which aspects of you are more your go-tos, and also what might you need to enlist to do things a bit differently in support of the work. And then also, when you're thinking about that, just take a moment to maybe just bring someone to mind who you might be thinking about today, who you're working with, who you know has a trauma history, and that you want to get some ideas on and think through. And then maybe just spend a few minutes just looking at where you see they are now in terms of the framework. So we usually say to people, do a bit of a traffic light system. So things that are going particularly well are your greens. There may be areas of work that have been done but been put on hold, so that's your amber. And then also, if there hasn't been any attention in some of the resilient moves, then those things will be red. And all of these are what we call resilient moves. So something that you can do in order to make a difference. So yeah, you've just been thinking about that. So now we're going to think through the framework, and then thinking about some things that you can do in each of the areas in support of, if you might be working with children who have experienced trauma, developmental trauma. What I mean by developmental trauma is trauma that they've experienced growing up. So that's what we mean by that. So grounding technique. So thinking about what I was saying about the brain. So just to refresh, so you've got the amygdala, which is the emotional part of the brain, and this gets triggered when the child or young person perceives that there's a threat. And remember, there's not necessarily a threat. If the child has been traumatized, then that part of their brain will have become oversensitive. So it may raise the alarm even when there isn't a threat. Yet actually, we just, it's still important to just be really mindful and compassionate about that, because for the child, obviously they feel like there is a threat. So it might feel out of nowhere for you. Yeah, actually for them, something very real has been triggered. And then what happens then, the frontal lobes, which are the logical, rational part of the brain, literally switch off. So the amygdala takes over, and so then we don't have a capacity to think, when we're in that state. Hence, when people say, "What were you thinking?" And chances are people aren't, because the frontal lobes get switched off. So here I have a stress ball, and the stress ball is great for helping the frontal lobes turn back on. So just by doing something like this that I'm doing now, I'm having to focus on the ball. So by having to focus, that brings my frontal lobes back on, because I need to concentrate. So you can get the child to throw it at the wall, depending on what state they're in, or, like I say, something as simple as that can be really helpful. Squeezing it as well, because that pressure, again, is very grounding. So that can be really useful. So there's lots of things that you can do with the stress ball. Here I've got some bubbles that aren't quite set up. But I know you all know how to use bubbles. And the bubbles is great if you can incorporate that with the breathing. So in the last seminar in part 1, we talked about breathing in for 3, hold for 3, 2, 3, breathe out for 3, breathe in for 3, 2, 3. So if you can integrate that with the bubbles, it becomes a really sort of fun thing for children to do. And then what happens when we're deep breathing is we get a release of the chemical oxytocin, which is the bonding chemical. And then that's exactly what cortisol needs. So cortisol is released into the brain when we're stressed. It's the stress hormone. So then oxytocin is like medicine for cortisol. So then that starts to calm the system down. So if you can integrate that, like I say, with the bubbles, that can be a really nice thing to do. And then we've also got some Play-Doh here as well. And sadly, I don't have a Blue Peter version, but again, similar to the stress ball in the hand. So that creates a pressure, just by playing, and it's very soothing as well, because obviously the Play-Doh is nice and soft, but that also then touches on those senses in the brain and turns on the frontal lobes. We also have a snuggle puppy here, and the snuggle puppy has a real feel heartbeat. So this might be useful to have in your classrooms, because children that are really traumatized, when they disconnect in their bodies, it can actually just really help them reconnect by connecting with something that has like I say, a kind of real feel heartbeat, and then that actually can feel really soothing. And if they haven't had necessarily positive experiences in terms of an attachment figure, and haven't had an opportunity to have a pet, then this can also be hugely reparative in terms of those experiences, and you can buy these online as well. So and other fun things, if you were to teach children some grounding exercises in the morning, for example, you can get them doing animal movements. So things like kind of being like a cat. So getting on all fours on the floor, stretching out their neck, and then lowering their back, and that can just be a fun thing to do. There's a lady online, Clara's Tales, and she has lots of free resources that you can download, and there's lots of fun activities there in terms of roaring like a lion, like I say, lying down like a cat. And then obviously the other good one is to just feel your feet on the floor and just crunch your toes like this, or getting children to squat, just literally squatting down, or star jumps. All of these things are just really useful for getting the child back into their bodies, and like I say, helping those frontal lobes turn back on again. This activity again can also be a bit of fun, but it's also, the thinking behind it is actually, again, because anxiety or trauma, there's a future focus, or it's, with trauma, for example, it feels unsettling. So again, this lets the child know that they're in the present and they're safe now. So you ask them to focus on 5 things to start with that they can see in the room, then 4 things that they can hear, 3 things that they can touch, 2 things that they can smell, And then the last one I say to people, and tell me about something that you're really good at, one thing that you're really good at. So yeah, so like I say, because they're looking around, noticing what they can see, what they can hear, what they can smell, it then, because there's an over-awareness on the threat, or in the future, for example, if it's anxiety, then it just really helps bring their focus back into the present. So I'm going to just go through each aspect of the framework. Our feedback from training is that people find it really helpful when we do this. If we just give you some ideas of things that you can do. So the framework is very flexible. So even though with good enough housing, yes, we are talking about housing per se. Like I say, you can also be really flexible with that. And then you could use that to think about, are your classrooms set up in a way that is supportive if children have sensory issues or have been traumatized in some way. So yeah, like I've just shown you, having those sort of things, or fidget toys, for example, having stress balls or resources that support grounding can be really beneficial to have in the classroom. And then, like I say, just when you start the day, because obviously as well, isn't it, children are coming from their homes in the morning, so we don't know what mornings are like. Chances are they may come stressed or agitated, so just, to teach one grounding exercise a day to start the day as a whole class could be really beneficial in terms of building their capacity, and also is going to be more conducive in terms of their learning as well. Having safe places or safe spaces in the classroom or in the school where children can go to calm down and soothe, if they need that time out. Again, thinking about children who might have sensory challenges. Sometimes it can be too much. It can be overly stimulating if there's 29 other children in the class. So it's really important that you understand and have a sense of your children and what their sensory needs are. And then, like I say, to build in if they need other spaces where they might need to go and calm down and soothe, or just take some time out. The other thing that could be really positive is supporting the children to take responsibility for their environment. So having different roles and responsibilities for looking after the space in the classroom, as this might not necessarily be happening at home. And then another really nice exercise is to for everyone to create some bunting to go around the room that has everybody's name on it, and to think about then how people are connected in the room, so that everyone feels part of decorating the room as well as knowing that they've got each other. So that can just be a really nice exercise to do in terms of supporting that sense of belonging. So for then that child, who may have a trauma history, they know that that classroom is their safe place where they feel held and they belong. So then thinking a bit more about belonging. So obviously belonging is really important for children who have, if they've got attachment trauma, for example, if that's what the trauma is connected to. And actually just by being consistent and a safe place where people can go in terms of yourself, that can go a really long way in terms of impacting on that attachment history. Like I say, just being consistent, reliable, safe, And then by doing that, you're also then teaching them how to be in relationships as well, and offering them a different experience to what they might have had or might have been subjected to. Then it's important as well that we teach children boundaries in relationships, that we make it safe to say no, that they learn that actually people can't always do things for them, or that there's limitations in terms of what people can offer, and that they have a right to have boundaries too. So these can be built into sort of PSHE type sessions, but also, I guess, isn't it more subtle than that? The conduct that's happening in the classroom and how people are treating each other, and what you encourage in terms of how people look after each other, and what is okay and what's not okay in terms of people's behaviour in relation to one another. So yeah, thinking about what does a healthy and safe relationship look like? Where do they feel they belong in the school community? Having peer mentors within the school that are there to support each other. So there's an example, and all of these things are on the Boingboing website, of a school where they set up playground angels. So they actually trained the children that had previously been involved in the bullying to be mentors to identify children who are struggling in the playground, or maybe seen as being on their own. So then the playground angels would look after them. Obviously, it's important if there's policies in place that focus on addressing bullying, that these are actually adhered to, because otherwise children often feel let down by the system if no one has got their back. And this can actually then be more detrimental in terms of not just their sense of belonging, but obviously their sense of self-worth as well, if they don't feel that anyone does anything. So it's important that we hear children, if they're struggling or going through something like that, and that there's mechanisms in place in the school for that to happen. And yeah, so it's really important that there's safe spaces for children to share and talk through any concerns or worries that they might be having. And like I say, if this needs to be in a way that's anonymous, really important that then it's followed up on, so that the children feel that they're heard. So just more suggestions here for, like I say, waking up those frontal lobes and thinking about how we can support children to understand themselves. So, and there's a diagram on the next page. Yeah, so you can use something like this, or draw out your own version, so that we can help children understand what happens in their bodies when they get triggered, because then, like I say, what you're doing here is you're building up that aspect of their long-term memory, so that over time they can identify that that's a trauma-related or anxious-related reaction. The link here, there's a really nice video there that explains the fight or flight or freeze response for children. So if you click on that link, you can paste that, and there's lots of great videos, particularly Pixar do a lot of fab videos using the Inside Out film. If you haven't seen the Inside Out film, you need to watch that. That's a really great way of showing children that all our emotions are really important. And Pixar have made some videos on, like I say, teaching about fight and flight and freeze. So they're really, really useful. Talk here about teaching children the difference between a belief about the world as a result of our experiences, or a feeling or emotion or physical sensation, so that they can differentiate what's happening in their body. So, for example, isn't it, if a child has a belief about the world that it's not safe in some way, and then helping them understand, where that's come, and also then helping them see, what does that feel like in their body when they feel that way, and then helping them separate, is that really in the moment, is the world really unsafe right now, so that then, like I say, they can separate what's happening in their bodies, what's being triggered, and also then what's happening in reality. And it's trying to do that in a way that really, really validates that early experience, and how great in a way that their body has been in trying to protect them and look out for them, and that sometimes, if it's had to do that a lot, that then, like I say, it kind of might have, got oversensitive or overworked, and may not necessarily be accurate. So it's trying to do that with lots of validation and lots of acknowledgement about their experience. And actually, of course, isn't it, their world may not have been safe, and also are there things about the bigger world that they have experienced as safe. So, like I say, just really helping them separate that out. So, and then if something does happen, just really trying to be curious. So curiosity, compassion, and empathy, they really change those neural pathways in the brain following an event, or so it can just be really useful. And you can do this using social stories or pictures. Just help the child just really understand what happened, what were they feeling before, what got them frightened, then how did they feel next, and helping them, like I say, work through the sequence, and then understand as well, what were they feeling in their body, what thoughts did they have in their mind, so that then they can build up a picture of what's happening for them. We talked about grounding before learning for the whole class, mindfulness activities, and there's a range of mindful activities for children that you can download now from the internet. There's a lovely little book called Sit Still Like a Frog, and that's got some really lovely mindfulness activities for children as well. And then now we're going to talk a bit more about connecting and then redirecting. So we all need this. So when you're feeling something, basically, so Dan Siegel has coined this term, connect and redirect, and he's a neuroscientist. And yeah, actually, like I say, we all need it. There's nothing worse when you're if you're in, you're having a discussion, isn't it, with your partner, you're trying to tell them how you feel, and then they come up with the logical explanation. So actually what we all need is people to connect with our feelings and really acknowledge those feelings. Because like I say, if a child has been triggered, they've gone into that fight or flight phase state, then for them their feeling feels very real. So it's really important, like I say, to go, gosh, that must feel really scary. So for example, as well, isn't it, children from about the ages of 7, 8, for example, feel like they've got monsters under the bed, and it's like, gosh, that must be really frightening to imagine that there's monsters under the bed, even though, like I say, we might not be able to see what's upset them. Just the power of really validating and acknowledging that feeling, because then actually feelings, once they're acknowledged, then they settle. So then there's some examples here of, you know, just how you can be really validating and really acknowledging of those feelings. And actually then, you know, measuring when it feels appropriate to then redirect with the logical information. And actually you should just get a sense of this when you feel like the person, you know, feels like they've been really validated and really acknowledged. So because, like I say, we all need this. And yeah, try not to rush in too soon with the logical information, because then that can feel dismissive, you know, just lots and lots of validation. Often here, and often there's some cues, isn't it? If someone repeats themselves, keeps trying to tell you something, then that for me is a good signal that they don't feel that that feeling has been validated enough. And then the redirect is the logic. So because I guess, you know, what you're doing is you're previously in the connect, you know, you're using your emotional brain to really connect with their emotional brain. And then what also happens is once our emotional brain has been connected with, we feel calmer, we feel acknowledged, and then the frontal lobes come on. So they're more open to that logical, rational information. So that's when you can come in. So, and also, do you remember that time when things went well? I try to move away from using the word but, because it can be dismissive. So I really get what you're saying, but like I say, that just tends to then wipe out what the person has said before. So use and rather than but. So yeah, I really get that you know, you're really feeling anxious. And then when the time's right, and also, do you remember that morning when things went really well? Let's have a think about what happened there. And yeah, again, like, so this is in particular in relation, some of these are in relation to school anxiety. So if things become too overwhelming, then we'll take you to a safe place in the school and we'll give you what you need. So you're really acknowledging, you know, even in the logical, rational information, you know, you can still really acknowledge the fear and the upset. The zones of regulation, again, this has been taken from the film Inside Out, and you can download this at www.childtherapyservice.org.uk, and Tracy has lots of resources on this website that you can use to help children understand their emotions. And again, so by helping children understand what zone they're in, what they feel, you know, what they're feeling when they're in that zone, and there's other resources in the pack that help them identify what they're feeling in their stomach, what they're feeling in their legs. It helps build up that procedural memory of, like I say, what emotional state they're in. And then this can be really helpful in terms of then thinking about what they might need to do, or what they might need in order to get them from a blue place to the green place, for example, or from a yellow place to the green place. And don't forget, sometimes what we first and foremost need is just those acknowledgement of those feelings before we can think about doing some of this stuff. So yeah, so you can see there, to help me feel green. And then it's like thinking about, isn't it, the conserving piece of the framework. So what has worked well before, you know, if you've been in a green place before, what's helped you get there, and helping them come up with ideas about what will support them. If you have this can, you know, from really vulnerable or anxious children, you know, kind of just getting up in the morning and getting to school can be really overwhelming. So these visual timetables can be really useful, not just for helping them take responsibility for themselves, but when there's anxiety, there's uncertainty, and there's fear about the future. So these visual timetables help provide that certainty about what's going to happen, and also what's going to be expected of them. Otherwise, that can be hugely overwhelming. And also, again, isn't it, we make no assumptions about what mornings have been like for them. So yeah, and these are great as well for just identifying any points in the day that might feel stressful or overwhelming, because again, it's about not trying to take anything for granted. And again, these can be downloaded at the Child Therapy Service website. So in terms of core self, so something more individual that you could do is help them understand the different parts of them. So if you notice that from the trauma, they have a very strong caretaker part. So this can be quite common if they're used to looking after mum or dad, or they've learned that actually it's safer to look after others. Again, just help them, just be curious with them. So the part of you that looks after others, how hard does that part of you work? Because then that's really validating. We're not looking to take these parts away. Actually it's about, like I say, kind of the validation and the acknowledgement, will really help the child be, thinking and be more curious with themselves. The part of you that tries so hard, how old was that part when it got its job? That gives you a bit more of a sense of what's been happening, and the story behind that part. And underneath, I guess, isn't it, these are protectors. So underneath there'll be a core belief, and you can reach the core belief by asking, what would that part be afraid of if it didn't try and protect you by taking care of others, or if it didn't try and protect you by working so hard? Because then you start to get to the core belief. So that part would be afraid that I wouldn't have any friends, or that part would be afraid that I wouldn't be good enough. And then how do you feel towards that part of you? That's another good way of just eliciting more information about how others might have responded. So because obviously in the family system, so how things are responded externally often become how things are responded to internally. So it helps you understand how the family might respond to emotions, for example, or ways of managing, or how invested others may be in that person looking after others, or how, like, well, that mum really supports the part of me that looks after others, because she does that too. So it just helps you find out more information that could be of real benefit. So as mentioned before, so it's really important to think about the child in terms of the whole system, and thinking about all dimensions of the young person's life, particularly when we're thinking about trauma, because there's so many intersecting layers. So here, if you think, so we've got the microsystem, and that's everybody who the child has direct access to, so the family, the school, peers, etc. Then you've got the mesosystem, and this is the connection between the structures in the microsystem. So, for example, the connection between the child's teacher and his parents, or the sports coach and the neighbourhood, for example. Then you've got the exosystem, which is the larger social system, and obviously can also impact on the microsystem, although the child may not be directly linked. So, for example, so in the exosystem, you've got the political system at the time. So, for example, without children knowing it, isn't it? So, under the Conservative government, there's significant cuts in terms of services or jobs. So this could really impact on mum or dad's job, or impacts on teaching resources or resources that are available for the schools. So even though the child might not be directly aware, of course, they're being impacted. Then you've got the macro system, which is the cultural values, laws, and beliefs within that system. And then you've got the chrono system, which is the dimension of time. So like that may involve kind of losing a grandparent, or values changing around gender identity, for example, or in terms of COVID. So, a year ago, we weren't all having to socially distance, and the massive impact that will have on children as well. So then it's looking at the child and then thinking them through in terms of those different layers, and then, like I say, kind of what are the barriers, or what's the impact of those different layers on this particular child, and also then are there any opportunities in those different systems to make resilient moves. So then therefore resilient moves cover all bases as opposed to just focusing on the child in their micro world, for example, because the research does show that we see the greatest impact with vulnerable children and young people when we shape their environments to meet their needs. So having a much more of a holistic approach. So then thinking about just being curious about basics, for example. So just more ideas really to help you be thinking about what do we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about these different compartments. So say, for example, let's take access and transport. So given the child's circumstance or experiences, like I say, their sensory needs, their kind of individual needs at home, what additional support do they need in terms of getting to school in the morning? Do they need a visual timetable? Do they need help with the structure? Do they need something sometimes as simple as an alarm clock? If there's difficulties at home or it's stressful and chaotic, like I say, just the child having an alarm clock, to help themselves get out of bed could go a really long way. Are there any triggers regarding their trauma on the way to school, or how do they get to school? Does it feel safe for them? Just again, it's just looking at the issue and then just really drilling down on an individual level and thinking about what the needs are. For example, is if parents are really struggling, there could a community of parents project where parents support each other in terms of their children and helping each other get to school. Like I say, are the mornings a chaotic time? Does the child need a wind down when they arrive at school? Are the mornings particularly stressful? If they're getting on public transport, how is that for them? Is there a local need around bus drivers and them being more aware and included in the school community, perhaps, in terms of understanding trauma and the impact, so that they're aware then with regards to the children that get on their buses and what support they might need, and or how do the children or parents experience the transport locally, and like I say, is there any joint working that can be done? So yeah, so it's just really important in terms of having, I guess, what we'd like to call a trauma-friendly school charter. So just really important that we know who the children are in the school who might have specialist needs or trauma histories because obviously not everyone will need specialist support. Yeah, it's really important for that child and also their success at school, if everyone is, well, not everyone is aware, but if people look out for them, and also that they've got a specified care plan in place in terms of supporting their needs. Important that everyone in the school understands about trauma and the impact of trauma, because then that really feeds into the next one in terms of encouraging that empathic approach to behaviour management. So if people are understanding that it's about the fight or flight response rather than naughty behaviour, because then how we respond to the behaviour then obviously helps build children's skills in terms of them responding to their own behaviour. Because isn't it, if somebody's in a fight or flight place and they're being responded to in an angry way, then anger will just compound the threat response, so they'll feel even more frightened, and it will compound the fight response. So then obviously how we respond to children when they're in that place will really impact on how they learn how to respond to themselves, and also help them in terms of those regulating skills. So yeah, and then important that we focus on, like we're saying, kind of attachment, belonging, helping them self-soothe, and just building their overall competence and capacity, which we've talked about before in terms of the resilience framework. Making sure that we co-produce everything that we do with parents at every opportunity, if possible, and then also recognising that parents also have their own trauma history. And there's a whole other seminar that we've prepared for you on working with marginalised parents as well. So do tap into that if you're interested in looking at about how you can engage and work with parents. We've been talking about trauma, and obviously when you're working with that, it can have an impact as well. So it's really important that there's adequate support in place for staff, especially when we think that mental health, it affects 1 in 6 people, so chances are somebody is affected. And also it's important that we know, when we're working with children and young people around trauma, that we know what presses our own buttons and what our own vulnerable parts are. So it's really important that staff are supported through that, and that we're prioritising staff in that as well. Yeah, like I say, isn't it, this is really challenging, so it's important that we prioritise relationships across the board in terms of all members of staff, and that there's a space for everyone to kind of gain that support, and also thinking then about the child's network as well, and fostering those relationships across their network, because that's ultimately going to be beneficial for the child then. And yeah, of course, and it probably goes without saying that when we're sharing information, that we do so sensitively and effectively. Of course, we want as many people to be able to support children, yet doing that alongside preserving confidentiality, and wherever, if we are sharing, to ensure that it's holding the best interest of the child and the parents and gets to the right people. So these are some things then that you can consider, when thinking about what resilient move to make in relation to working with trauma. So what are the finer details of this issue that need considering? So what I mean by this is, so say for example, is it a domestic violence issue that has resulted in the trauma? Then what do we know about the impact of domestic violence on the child, that we need to be thinking about in terms of then thinking about what resilient moves? So we know with domestic violence, for example, that the child's relationships might be at risk, or their social development may be at risk. So that's what we mean there. It's like what has kind of resulted in the trauma, and then what is the impact that then we might need to consider first before then thinking about what resilient moves we're going to make. And there is a whole other seminar on domestic violence as well that you can access to. Does the resilient move support the whole school, or is it an individual move? Either is great. Obviously, there's real value in making the individual moves, and also particularly if you live or if you work in a disadvantaged area where there is trauma and poverty, is there a way that move can then be of benefit to the whole school? Is the move realistic given the resources that you currently have within the school? Is there anything that can be done, quick? Like getting the alarm clock, for example, that could be a potential quick win. Are there any other opportunities in the community that support this need that might have been overlooked? And are there any other services that could be enlisted in support of doing what you want to do? So to finish then, these are 10 things that Boingboing have suggested should be put in place in order for a resilience approach to work across the whole school. So yes, and I meant to mention this earlier actually. Obviously, it's really important if you've got children who have trauma histories that actually, if they can have at least one trusted adult who they can have access to over time, who they can go to if they need support, that can be really beneficial. But just, and then this is just more generally that lets pupils know that they hold them in mind and know that they care. Again, isn't it, if children haven't had that, that can go a really long way. And the research evidence shows us that it's really important for children and young people that they have someone in their life who they trust, who they know values them and holds them in mind. Having a willingness and capacity to help with the basics, so food banks, clothing, transport, and even housing. Making sure, like I said earlier, that vulnerable pupils actually can access hobbies and activities rather than just suggesting them or signposting them. Helping pupils be better at problem solving at every opportunity. So we know from the research around resilience that actually teaching children to problem solve is a really important skill in terms of their resilience. Creating safe places. So like I said earlier, if there's places children can go in the school to self-soothe and calm down, or have somebody with them to help them, that can be really beneficial. And then obviously you can do that work around how people create individual safe places, so safe places inside themselves too, as well as having them externally. Helping to map out a sense of the future and the life skills in order to take advantage of opportunities. So, empowering children and young people with this sense of self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is the idea that I can do. Because I guess as well, it's about being aware of the context in which they're living in. And if aspirations are low, then it's going to be hard for them, in terms of their sense of belonging, to step out of that. So it's how we, kind of raise awareness and hope that things can be different, and that they, that they can do and they can achieve. And there's lots of opportunities out there for them to take advantage of. We've talked a lot about helping pupils to cope or teaching those self-soothing strategies and grounding techniques. Opportunities to volunteer or have a sense of purpose in the school community, so having roles and responsibility. And then, this one here, one of my favourite ones, so everyone having a responsibility around resilience and empowering the school community to understand what it is and how everyone can support it, and everyone in the school community, so like saying parents, carers, children, young people, everyone. And then lastly, number 10, so high intensity, resilient moves based on individuals' needs and with a joined up approach between home, school, and other organisations for those that need it. So I hope you've found that useful and gives you some ideas of how you can support children with trauma histories. And there's lots of, please do check out the website at www.boingboing.org.uk, because there's lots of reading and resources that you can download. There's a resource called the Resilient Classroom, and it's got lots of ideas and activities that correspond to the different aspects of the framework, and like I say, different activities that you can use in your teaching or in your lessons, or that just give you ideas thinking about the school in terms of a resilience approach across the school. There's the mental health in school toolkit as well on the website, and that breaks down each mental health difficulty from anxiety, eating difficulties, post-traumatic stress, and gives you options in terms of how to respond from the framework as well in each of those compartments. So please do check out the website, as there's lots of additional resources that you can take advantage of. And I really hope you've enjoyed today's session. And don't forget, you don't have to watch it all in one go. I'm telling you this now at the end, but it actually, you know, might be useful to kind of just break it down. If you've gone through it all an hour and 20 minutes of it, then you have it there. You can go back and go over things, and do check out those other resources as well that I mentioned from the Child Therapy Service and Clara at Tales, and there's lots of great resources out there, especially for this age group, which is fantastic. Okay, take care. Bye.